Praise be Jesus Christ, now and forever. If we are looking to have a title for this weekend's theme from our readings, allow me to suggest outrageous grace. Why? Well, each of the readings touch upon God's grace, but especially the parable that Jesus tells. It's a most familiar parable, perhaps a bit too familiar, especially the concluding instruction about humility and exaltation. But let us listen to the parable more attentively. Recall that Luke tells us that with this parable, Jesus is addressing those who are convinced of their own righteousness and who despise everyone else. May we not be counted among that group, but may we open our spiritual ears to hear Jesus' revelation about outrageous grace. A Pharisee and tax collector in the temple praying. You couldn't have two more polar opposites. The Pharisee is a professional religious man, a strict observer of the Mosaic law, who takes spiritual matters seriously, a follower of the rules, a privileged member of God's people. The tax collector is working with the occupying Romans against his own people. He is making his money off the backs of his own. He has no standing within God's people. He is despised for what he is doing. Do you see what Jesus is setting up here? Now their prayers. Jesus tells us that the Pharisee spoke this prayer to himself. An interesting observation and description. This becomes most obvious as Jesus tells us what the Pharisee prays. He is comparing himself to others, defining himself by what he is doing. In essence, he's telling God that God owes him for all that he is doing in his own life. The Pharisee gives no indication that he has any need for God. The tax collector, on the other hand, does not even dare to raise his eyes. He bows, beats his breast, praying, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Here is true self-knowledge. Here is true knowledge of God and the ways of God. The tax collector knows he is nothing in comparison to God, who is all glorious, all powerful, all righteous. Looking at the perfection of God reveals his own imperfection and his self-understanding that he needs the mercy of God. The Pharisee, who certainly was doing many good things and rightful things, did not know God. Doing the right things failed to help him to connect with God personally and intimately. He became proud and self-righteous, failing to realize that God is the source and the strength of anything that we do that is good. The tax collector, seeing who God is and seeing his total lack of standing before God, prays humbly, asking God to be merciful, or in other words, to be the atoning sacrifice for him who is a sinner. Allow me to share some dialogue from C.S. Lewis's fantasy story called The Great Divorce. A busload of people from hell are driven to the gates of heaven and offered admission. Only one goes in, but he becomes upset, meeting in heaven a fellow he knew on earth who had committed murder. How could this be? This murderer didn't earn the right to be in heaven. The citizen from hell, complaining, says, and remember, this is British, "Look at me now. I've gone straight all my life. I didn't say I was a religious man, and I don't say I had no faults, far from it. But I'd done my best all my life, you see. That's the sort of chap I was. I never asked for anything that wasn't mine by rights. If I wanted to drink, I paid for it. And if I took my wages, I'd done my job, see? I am asking for nothing but my rights. I'm not asking for anybody's bleeding charity. The heavenly citizen looks him directly in the eye and says, then do, at once, ask for the bleeding charity. That's what the tax collector asked for. That's what each and every one of us must ask for, giving up any pretenses we hold on to. Jesus is the bleeding charity, the atoning sacrifice for sin, because not one of us can compare to God. When we take our eyes off of ourselves and off of one another, and when we focus ourselves on God, then we see clearly and humbly we are able to pray the truth. O God, be merciful to me, a sinner. O God, be the atoning sacrifice for me, a sinner. And with that, we enter into God's outrageous grace.